Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm SIDDHANTH and you're watching Daily Debrief, the show where we try to take you behind the headlines on some of the most important global news stories. It's our final show of the week, and today we're talking about a vital election in Chile. We're talking about Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we're talking about the heightening economic crisis in Turkey. First up, tomorrow on December 19th, Chile will vote on a crucial election that will impact the future of democracy in that country. In a closely run presidential race, for which campaigning is now closed, progressive Gabriel Boric of the left-wing Apruebo Dignidad coalition faces far-right candidate Jose Antonio Cast. Cast, a 55-year-old lawyer and congressman, got more votes in the first round of that election, but Boric, who is 20 years younger and a former student activist, has led polls ever since. We spoke earlier to People's Dispatch's Zoe Alexandra for more.
Thank you, Zoe, so much for joining us. So, very key election happening on Sunday in Chile. Of course, two very opposing visions in terms of candidates, both of whom have come, Cast and Boric. So, could you maybe quickly first take us to what each of these candidates represents and what really is their vision for Chile?
Yes, so the two candidates that are going to be contesting in this Sunday's runoff presidential elections in Chile are Jose Antonio Cast, of the Republican Party of Chile, and Gabriel Boric, who ran in the primaries for the Progressive Alliance, and he won against Daniel Jadwe. And so he represents the broad left coalition that has been brought together with groups like the Communist Party, but also more social democratic parties. He represents kind of trying to bring some of the demands of the movement on the street, the demands for writing a new constitution in Chile, demands for guaranteeing basic rights such as education and healthcare to all Chileans. Gabriel Boric has already expressed his intent to take these promises into office when he is, if he's elected. Jose Antonio Cast, on the other hand, he's an interesting character. His father was in the Nazi Party of Germany. They immigrated from Germany to Chile when in the 50s. He has made allusions to the democratic nature of Pinochet's dictatorship, saying that the constitution that was written during Pinochet's military dictatorship, that this was, the basis of democracy of Chile. He has made very disparaging comments against migrants, against women. He has a very firm position against, for example, rewriting the constitution, against granting rights that are currently seen as privileges, such as education and healthcare. He's also, on an international level, has been part of different international kind of groups and initiatives to bring together far-right parties and organizations across Latin America, but also in Europe. And he recently, a week ago, was in the United States, and he had meetings with elected representatives such as Marco Rubio, but also key members of the private sector, including representatives of private healthcare companies. So these, two candidates, as you said, could not be more different, and they are going to face off this Sunday in Chile. The polling has indicated thus far that Gabriel Boric would have a slim majority, but it's really been neck and neck for this whole time. So it remains to be seen.
Right, Zoe. And in this context, could you also talk about something you mentioned, which is the process of rewriting the constitution? So what is the relevance of this election, considering this process that is going to take place in this coming year as well?
Yeah, so one of the key demands of the social uprising that took place in Chile in 2019, beginning in October with a high school students' protest against a fee hike, which, as we covered at People's Dispatch, erupted into so much more about these basic demands for fundamental rights such as education, healthcare. During this uprising, one of the key, things that movements on the ground were recognizing was that one of the core reasons that these rights are not guaranteed to the people, one of the reasons why Chile is such an unequal society, is because the Constitution for example, does not grant and does not recognize these fundamental rights. And that is kind of the basis of all the institutionality in Chile, is meant to exclude, is meant to favor some over the majorities. And so the key demand in these protests, in addition to an end to police violence and the kind of repression that was seen during this uprising, was really the fundamental demand to rewrite the Constitution. And through a process of the Constitutional Assembly and Constitutional Convention. So in the last year, Chileans went to the polls in another instance to vote on a referendum of whether or not there should be a process of rewriting the Constitution, whether it should be as a constitutional convention or a National Constituent Assembly. And then this year, they voted on who would be composing this constitutional convention. And in these elections, it was really crucial because the progressive and independent forces were the ones who dominated, who won a majority. And so, the demands of the people on the street are represented in this process. This is already underway. Actually, they've begun this process, and it will continue during the next year. However, Jose Antonio Cast has said that he is against this process. I'm not sure, for example, legally, what precedent the president would have to, terminate this kind of process, but he certainly would put roadblocks in the way if elected.
Right. Thank you so much, Zoe. We'll be following this issue in the coming days after the results as well.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, in 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its report on the country's deeply racist and inhuman Indian residential schools. We're marking 6 years of the release of that report, which included, based on the testimony of over 6,000 brave survivors and witnesses, 94 calls to action as a route to follow if Canada was serious about repairing its relationships with Indigenous people. Anish joins us now. Anish, why is it particularly important, even more than usual this year, to be marking and talking about this anniversary?
I think that's a good question because this year as such has been quite revelatory when it comes to Canada's relationship with its Indigenous peoples, native nations. We have to call them nations because a lot of them are still facing the effects of colonialism, the institutions built on colonialism. This year, about 1,400 grave sites were discovered from just 5 of these Indian residential schools. We have to remember there were more than 100, close to like 120 of such Indian residential schools that operated historically across Canada. And of these, from just 5, you got something close to 1,400 possible grave sites. And that shows the extent of not only the mortality and the abuse that existed in these schools, but at the same time, even the estimates that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came up with were also quite far off. The Commission's report was tabled. The final report obviously came out 6 years ago in 2015. And in that, the Commission documented about 3,200, around that figure, of documented deaths in these schools over a span of between 1890s to 1950s.
Right.
And from there, you have them estimating that there could be other undocumented deaths, especially during the 30s and 40s when it was, infamously overcrowded. There were diseases across Canada that were not where Indigenous communities faced a lot of neglect, especially in these schools. So they came up with an estimated that it says it could be more than 6,000. Many Indigenous groups have also said that is a very conservative estimate and figure to come up with, and many have argued that it could be more than 10,000 or more. And we can see that already, like if you discover more than 1,400 grave sites in just 5 schools, and there are still dozens of them to be
Examined,
and trying, surveyed. And this is just surveys. You have to really just go through how much of this was documented, how much of this was, because most of them are unmarked graves. And there is absolutely no record of who these people were. So you have to really just try to piece together the identity of these victims.
Right.
And most of
the
them,
conditions in which they died as well.
exactly. And it is going to be a very major task on the hands of the government, be it the current government or any government that comes up in the future.
Yeah.
And so it is not just the death scale that we have to look at, it is also the larger legacy of these schools. Obviously, these schools, most of them, almost all of them, stopped operating as they existed by the 60s. But we still have that legacy intact, because we are looking at children who were pretty much forced out of their communities, out of their homes. Attendance was mandatory until 1947.
Right.
And in many cases, as the commission, and this is where the legacy of that commission comes through, because in many cases, the children were just completely torn away from their parents.
Yeah.
They were, many of them could not meet them. They were sent to residential schools that were not even close to their communities or their lands. And most of them were cut off from their culture, language, and it caused kind of what it actually very correctly called is cultural genocide, where you have entire languages going extinct, even though the people haven't gone extinct. Their cultural history, all of it just completely wiped out through these schools. And this is the responsibility not only falls on the government, but also on the Catholic Church, which ran most of these schools. More than 2/3 of these schools at the time in 1930s were actually run by missionaries that belonged to that were affiliated to the Catholic Church. So in many of these, you have to that legacy still carries on. As you said, there are still thousands of victims, survivors, who continue to fight for justice, for reparations, something that is not even now forthcoming. And the discoveries that we had this year obviously also brought out a larger issue of what the government has not done since the commission's reports came out.
Right.
We have to remember that the commission gave out what it calls calls of action, which are essentially like recommendations of.
Yeah, that was in fact going to be my next question.
Yeah.
That 94, we mentioned the 94 calls to action. So to what extent, what has been the action on these calls by the Canadian government in the past 6 years?
So many indigenous groups, independent reviewers, even news medias have actually tried to keep track of what parts of the recommendations were implemented by the Canadian government. The Yellowhead Institute estimates something like about only 11 of these calls of actions to have been fully completed,
right,
of the 94.
Right.
All of them symbolic, something like, or something that does not require any kind of change in material institutions.
Right.
Nothing about reparations, nothing on trying to compensate the families affected by this, these schools. None of that has even started, coming, or even a policy matter or a white paper on that matter has been given out by the government. At the same time, some of these recommendations came after these gravesites started being discovered this year in May with the Kamloops Indian Residential Schools premises. We saw the Canadian government pushing forth some of the bills even that were just languishing in the parliament for a long while, which includes the Orange Shirt Day, which is also officially called the National Day for Reconciliation, and which falls on September 30. And so this year was the first time ever in Canada's history that an official holiday was observed, trying to remember the atrocities of these schools. But we also need to remember that these schools are just one part of the Canadian colonial history. A large part of the colonialism still exists. There is a huge debate and controversy even today, even to this day, about the status of Indian lands, or as they are called, Indian lands, or indigenous lands that belongs to the community, what authority they have, especially when we look at the fact that Canada is still one of the biggest builders of oil pipelines in the world right now.
We were talking about this on the show.
Exactly, just a couple of weeks ago, months ago, I'm not sure. But even then, in these cases, we have seen how indigenous groups are at the forefront against these pipeline constructions, against these projects that are going to affect our environment in major ways. And the Canadian government, be it the state governments or the federal government, have shown complete reluctance to take the right side, to be very fair. And they have actually gone to the point of just repressing these movements and resistance one after the other.
Right.
But at the same time, it also gave an awakening call, like this year, for Canadian people as a whole, about their history, and we saw that coming out when we saw like all these demonstrations and memorials being held across the country, when the grave sites were being discovered, of how not just indigenous people, but also the majority white communities coming out, grieving for these children. So it shows that there is a certain reckoning that happened this year, and
an acknowledgement of this troubled history.
Exactly. But the acknowledgement has been a long time. Yes, has been going on for a long time. But we also need to really look at how much of that acknowledgement goes into actually
changing the material conditions in which they exist.
Exactly. And that and the colonial legacy, which still as I said, still affects them. The land sovereignty is a matter that is still not,
anywhere close to
resolution. And this makes it all the more important for the community to organize and fight to move forward in a more just way.
Thanks a lot, Anish. And our final story of the week is from Turkey, where President Recep Tayyip Erdogan made the announcement this week during a televised press conference that Turkey will raise its minimum wage by about 50% from next year, to ease the hardship the people of the country are facing in the midst of soaring inflation and a Turkish lira that has lost half its value vis-a-vis the US dollar since January 2021. Prashant is on the show now. Prashant, the president is spinning this as the biggest wage hike in 50 years, but is it anywhere close to being enough?
Right. So what we know, of course, is that over the past week or 10 days actually, and even before, Turkish trade unions, Turkish workers actually have been organizing a series of major protests, culminating in a massive protest on December 12th. And their demand was very simple. They wanted the current minimum wage, which is 2,850 Turkish lira, that's around $182. They wanted to rise it to be risen to 5,200 Turkish lira, that's about $358. So Erdogan's announcement makes it around $4,250 Turkish lira, which is around $270. Now, it's to be remembered that although he's celebrating it as the biggest wage hike in 50 years, a massive achievement for workers, etc., this is happening at a time of massive inflation. And the extent of inflation is very difficult to actually explain because it has completely ruined the lives of the working people of Turkey. For instance, we have the fact that even your rent is around 2,000. Rent for a family is around 2,000 Turkish lira itself, which is almost half of most of what the previous minimum wage was, and close to half of the new one. So it's a real question as to whether this kind of a increase, which even though it looks big in terms of lira numbers, in terms of dollars, when you look at the value, it's actually much lesser. So in terms of purchasing power ability, it doesn't look like the Turkish workers are really going to benefit much from it. And this is a thing that the Turkish unions, especially the Confederation of Progressive Unions, which has organized the strike, the Turkish Communist Party, many of these organizations have been highlighting for the longest time. In fact, after this wage increase was announced, many of them released a statement saying that they were not happy with it. And one of the key things they pointed out was that the minimum wage is often taken as a standard wage in Turkey by many employers, which means that a minimum wage is supposed to be just that, right? It's minimum somebody's supposed to get. On the other hand, for many employers, this is a standard wage, which means that an individual working a full-time job might even just get this amount. And if they have to support a large family, it becomes increasingly very, very difficult. So their savings have been destroyed, their ability to purchase has been destroyed, hunger, destitution, all this have become a huge reality for Turkey. And it's also important to note that the minimum wages in Turkey were one of the lowest in the OECD countries. So it really shows when you look at Turkey in comparison to, say, its neighbors, other countries of a similar economic status, we really see that the workers of Turkey are really struggling. And all this is also happening, of course, as the lira has lost half its value, like you said, which really, throws a massive spanner on a lot of stuff that's being imported. For instance, Turkey imports a lot of its oil and gas, which means people who need to, and we know that, say, oil and gas prices actually determine a lot of your livelihood because, it's not only for cooking, it's for transport. All of these really depend on your gas prices. And if these gas prices if the amount you need to pay for these gas prices keeps increasing because of inflation, basically even an increase in salaries, everything gets destroyed. So what we're seeing right now is actually a very difficult crisis for workers in Turkey. What we're seeing right now, a very haunting situation for the workers, so to speak. There are accounts, People's Dispatch has carried some reports of trade unionists and other workers talking about how the price of bread, which is a huge essential in Turkey, or the price of other food items, it is so unaffordable right now that people are very close to starvation.
So what sort of action are workers and trade unions planning to mount in the face of all
Right. So, of course, there's continuous protest, but there's also a question of a larger policy framework that we need to look at here. And the issue here, of course, is the fact that the inflation has been rising massively. 21% is the official number, but there are independent estimates which say that inflation could be as high as 58%. Now, this is actually a deliberate policy measure in some senses because Erdogan has been playing around with interest rates and the value of the lira, which is what we're talking about. So why is the value of the lira, why is the lira or the Turkish currency being devalued as opposed to the dollar? It is basically to ensure that, say, Turkey becomes an easy, say, destination for foreign investment. Right. So when you have when foreign companies have to come to invest in Turkey, they have to pay lesser money because the value of the lira to the dollar is, the lira is valued much lower.
Skewed,
right. So in that case, what happens is that foreign companies actually have to spend much less money because they're bringing dollars. That's one thing. Secondly, also the idea is to enable tourism because, you again have people coming on from abroad.
Same logic.
Exactly. So they may be more interested in coming because Turkey has become such a cheap destination. So at this point of time, what we're seeing is that in order to sort of solve the balance of payments, so to speak, what Erdogan is doing is he's sacrificing the lives and livelihoods of workers so that the economy can be stabilized a bit. And this is a very, very dangerous gamble. We are playing with the lives of millions of people. And there is, of course, there's been reportage in, for instance, sites like Moon of Alabama, which is based on other reports that what he's trying to do is avoid taking an IMF loan. And it's for that reason that this is the policy that Erdogan is framing, because taking an IMF loan means that you have to listen to IMF conditions. The Americans will again have an influence on Turkey's policies. Turkey repaid back all of its loans in 2013 and now it doesn't want apparently to take a fresh loan. But in order to go into that direction, what's happening is basically that the lives of workers, like I said, is being put at stake. And this is a very, very dangerous ballgame because we know, of course, COVID-19, now the Omicron variant has come. There might be a fresh series of lockdowns, closures, travel restrictions across the place. And this is going to affect workers all the more. As it is over the past 2 years across the world, the workers, the people who run our society as it is, are the people who have been hit the most. There's been very little support from governments. There's been very little support from institutions. All the support money, most of the support money has gone to support big industries and banks. There's been very little that has actually trickled down to the workers. And then at a situation like this, soaring inflation is one of the worst things the workers of Turkey could ask for.
Absolutely. All right. That's all we have on the show for today. From Prashant, myself and the entire People's Dispatch team, thank you for watching. You can get more on all of these stories from our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and also updates on our social media channels. We'll be back same time, same place next week. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.